February 1st, 2026. 12:15 in the afternoon. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrive at a quiet residential home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood just outside Tucson, Arizona. They are responding to a missing persons report. An elderly woman did not appear at church that morning. Her family went to check on her and found her gone. Standard procedure. A welfare check, a missing persons response. The kind of call that law enforcement agencies handle dozens of times every week across the country. But within the first minutes of entering that home, something changed. Not gradually. Not after hours of investigation and deliberation. Not after a lengthy assessment process that required consultation with supervisors or specialists. Within the first minutes of walking through that door, the officers understood that what they were looking at was not a missing persons case. What they were looking at was a crime scene. And within a very short time after that initial assessment, homicide investigators were called. The FBI was notified. Search and rescue teams began mobilizing, and the home of Nancy Guthrie was sealed, secured, and processed with the full weight of a violent crime investigation. What did they find? What evidence was present in that home on the afternoon of February 1st that drove that response with such immediacy and such certainty? What did the scene reveal that told experienced law enforcement professionals, within minutes of their arrival, that something violent had happened inside those walls? What was so immediately apparent, so obviously inconsistent with a simple missing person situation, that the response shifted from welfare check to crime scene investigation almost instantaneously? Some of it has been made public, some of it has not. And what has been made public, when examined carefully, thoroughly, and with the kind of analytical depth that this case deserves, tells a story that is both deeply disturbing and critically important to understanding what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie in the hours between January 31st and the morning of February 1st, 2026. This is a deep examination of the evidence, not the ransom notes, not the speculation, not the social media theories, not the online discussions that have turned this tragedy into a forum for amateur detective work. The actual evidence, the physical evidence and the digital evidence that investigators documented at that scene, and that has driven every investigative decision made in the days and weeks since Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. The evidence that tells the real story of what happened, independent of what any ransom note claimed or what any online theory proposed. If you want to understand this case at the level the evidence actually supports, if you want to look past the headlines and examine what the forensics tell us about what happened inside that home, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to True Crime Vault right now and hit that notification bell, because this channel exists to do exactly this kind of analysis. Real evidence, real investigation, real answers as they become available. No speculation presented as fact, no theory treated as conclusion, just the evidence and what it tells us. Hit that like button as well, because it helps this content reach the people who want to understand cases at this depth. Now let us go through the evidence piece by piece, category by category, and let the facts speak for themselves. To understand what the evidence at Nancy's home tells us, we first need to understand who Nancy Guthrie was, what her daily life looked like, and what her physical circumstances were in early 2026. Because the context of her life is not just background information. It is essential to interpreting what the evidence means and to understanding why certain findings at the scene carry the weight that they do. Nancy Long Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942 in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She grew up in an era defined by different community structures, different relationships between neighbors, and a different pace of daily life from what most people experience today. She married Charles Guthrie, and together they built a family and a home. In the early 1970s, the Guthrie family made the decision to relocate to the Tucson area of southern Arizona. That relocation would define the rest of Nancy's life. She put down roots in the desert community that would span more than 5 decades. More than 50 years of history in one place. More than 50 years of neighbors and church friends and familiar streets and community connections that accumulate over a lifetime of consistent, engaged presence in one place. Her husband Charles died in 1988 while on a mining exploration trip in Mexico. He was 49 years old. Nancy was left to navigate the rest of her life as a widow, raising her children, managing her household, continuing to build the life she had established in the Tucson area. By every account available, she did so with quiet resilience. She did not retreat from her community after her husband's death. She remained active, engaged, present. She attended her church every Sunday, reliably and consistently, to the point where her absence on a single Sunday morning was immediately noticed and remarked upon by fellow congregants who knew her well enough to recognize when something was wrong. She had 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. Savannah Guthrie needs no introduction to anyone who watches American television or follows American journalism. She has been a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show for over a decade, one of the most watched morning programs in the United States. She has moderated presidential debates. She has covered major national and international events. She has become one of the most recognizable faces in American broadcast journalism, a household name in a country where household names in that profession are increasingly rare. The connection between Savannah's extraordinary public profile and her mother's disappearance is part of what gave this case its extraordinary national visibility from the very first hours it was reported. This was not simply a missing persons case out of Tucson. This was the mother of one of America's most prominent journalists. And that meant the story was going to reach every corner of the media landscape from the moment it broke. But for understanding the evidence, what matters most is not Savannah's fame. What matters is who Nancy was, how she lived, and what her physical circumstances were in early 2026. Nancy lived alone in her home in the Catalina foothills, a residential community in the foothills of the Santa Catalina Mountains, just northeast of Tucson. The Catalina foothills is characterized by quiet streets, desert vegetation, mountain views, and a residential pace of life that suits people who value privacy and community in equal measure. For an elderly woman living independently, it was a setting that worked well. Her home was her domain. Her routines were her own. She moved through her days with the independence that, by all accounts, was a defining characteristic of her personality. Her physical condition in early 2026 is relevant to understanding the evidence in ways that are both obvious and deeply significant. Nancy had significant mobility limitations. Law enforcement officials stated publicly, with a level of specificity that was clearly intentional, that she could not walk 50 yards without assistance. Let that measurement sit with you for a moment. 50 yards. The length of half a football field. She could not manage that distance unassisted. This is not a minor limitation. This is a physical reality that fundamentally constrains what a person can do independently, where they can go, and how quickly they can move from one place to another. She relied on daily medication for a chronic health condition, not occasional medication, not medication she took when she felt a particular way. Daily medication, required, essential, not optional for managing her health. Medication that she had to take every day to maintain her condition and that she could not simply go without for any extended period without health consequences. And she had a pacemaker, a cardiac monitoring device implanted in her body to regulate her heart rhythm, connected to a companion application on her smartphone that maintained a continuous digital link between the device and a monitoring system accessible to her and her cardiologist. Modern pacemaker monitoring applications are sophisticated tools that track device performance, record data, and maintain a digital relationship between the patient's body and the technology designed to monitor it. That connection is designed to be persistent, automatic, and reliable. It does not disconnect casually. These 3 physical realities, the severe mobility limitation, the daily medication requirement, and the pacemaker with its digital monitoring application, are the context through which every piece of evidence at the scene must be interpreted. Because they tell us what Nancy needed to function independently, what she could not do without, and what the digital record of her condition looked like in the hours before and after her disappearance. The day of January 31st, 2026 proceeded as a normal Saturday for Nancy. In the late afternoon at 5:32, she took an Uber to her daughter Annie's home for dinner. Annie is married to Tommaso Cioni. The dinner was an unremarkable family gathering, an elderly mother visiting her daughter and son-in-law for a meal. Nothing about that evening, by any account available, was unusual or concerning. It was the kind of Saturday evening that happens in families everywhere, every week. Dinner concluded, and at 9:48 in the evening, Nancy was driven home by Tommaso Cioni. He dropped her off at her residence in the Catalina foothills. At 9:50, security systems at her property registered the closing of the garage door. Tommaso reportedly drove away at that time. Nancy Guthrie was home. She was, as far as anyone in the world knew at that moment, safe for the night. That is the last confirmed moment anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. What happened next is documented in a timeline that investigators released publicly on February 5th, and it is a timeline that, when examined with the kind of careful analytical attention it deserves, tells a story that is far more specific and far more revealing than many people initially understood. The timeline divides into two distinct phases. The first phase is the quiet period, from 9:50 in the evening, when the garage door closed and Tommaso drove away, to 1:47 in the morning, when the first camera disconnected. That is a period of approximately 4 hours during which, as far as the available evidence suggests, nothing happened that the security systems registered. Nancy was home. The cameras were functioning. The surveillance systems were operating normally. The pacemaker application was maintaining its connection. For 4 hours, the technology monitoring her home and her health showed nothing unusual. And then the second phase began. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera at Nancy's home disconnected, not due to a power outage, not due to a Wi-Fi disruption or a technical malfunction consistent with normal equipment behavior. We know this because the FBI subsequently recovered footage from that camera through back-end server systems, footage that shows exactly what caused the disconnection. Someone was at the camera, a specific person, a person who was masked, who was wearing gloves, who was carrying a backpack, and who was carrying a gun. That person reached the camera at 1:47 in the morning and did something to it that caused it to cease functioning at that precise moment. At 2:12 in the morning, 25 minutes after the first camera disconnected, software on another camera somewhere on the property detected movement. The motion sensor activated. The system registered a presence in its field of view, but there was no video. No recording was available for investigators to review. The camera's recording capability had been compromised in a way that produced motion detection without usable footage. Something or someone was detected at the property at 2:12, moving in a way that triggered a sensor, but the visual record of that movement was not available. At 2:28 in the morning, 16 minutes after the second camera detected movement, and 41 minutes after the first camera disconnected, the application connected to Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her phone. 3 technological events: 1:47, 2:12, 2:28, 41 minutes from first to last, each one documented with the precision of digital systems that record timestamps automatically and continuously, each one telling part of the story of what happened at Nancy Guthrie's property during the deepest part of that Sunday morning. This is the 41-minute window that the evidence describes. This is the window that investigators have been reconstructing through forensic analysis, through digital evidence recovery, through the careful examination of everything the surveillance systems recorded or failed to record. And this is the window that contains the answer to what happened to Nancy. Now let us examine each category of physical and digital evidence in the detail it deserves, because each category speaks to a different dimension of what occurred, and together they form a picture that is coherent, consistent, and deeply troubling. The first and perhaps most significant category of physical evidence is the blood. Investigators confirmed publicly that bloodstains were found at or near the entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home. This confirmation came after forensic processing that included DNA testing, and the result of that testing was unambiguous. The blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. This is not a contested fact. This is a forensically confirmed, publicly stated investigative finding that forms one of the foundational pieces of evidence in this case. Blood evidence is one of the most powerful and most informative categories of forensic evidence available to investigators. Unlike many types of evidence that require interpretation or that can be explained in multiple ways depending on context, blood evidence that is confirmed through DNA testing to belong to a specific individual tells investigators something specific and important. It tells them that the person whose DNA matched was bleeding at or near the location where the blood was found. The location of the blood at Nancy's home is the first dimension of this evidence that requires careful analysis. Blood at or near the entrance. The entrance is where people come and go. It is the threshold between the interior space of the home and the exterior world. In a residential setting, the entrance is typically one of the most significant locations in terms of what it tells you about movement into and out of the property. Events that occur at the entrance, events that leave evidence at the entrance, speak to moments of transition, of crossing the threshold, of movement between inside and outside. Blood at the entrance of a home that a person has disappeared from raises immediate and significant questions about the circumstances of their departure from that home. If a person voluntarily leaves their home, they do not typically bleed at their own entrance. Voluntary departure, even hurried departure, does not leave blood evidence at the threshold. Blood at the entrance speaks to something that happened there, an event, a contact, a physical occurrence that caused a person to bleed at that specific location. The amount of blood, while not specified publicly in numerical or volumetric terms, was significant enough to be documented by responding officers and significant enough to warrant DNA testing to confirm its source. This tells us something important about the quantity involved. Blood evidence that requires documentation and DNA testing is not a small smear or a minor trace. It is blood that is visible, noticeable, and interpretable as evidence of an event that caused meaningful injury. Minor injuries, superficial cuts, small scrapes typically do not produce the kind of blood evidence that investigators document, collect samples from, and send to a laboratory for DNA confirmation. The pattern of the blood, the way it was distributed across surfaces at the entrance, is information that investigators have not publicly disclosed. But pattern analysis is one of the most informative dimensions of blood evidence in crime scene investigation. Drops of blood falling vertically from a stationary person tell a different story from smears created by contact with a moving surface. Transfer patterns created by a hand or a body part coming into contact with a surface tell a different story from projected patterns created by active bleeding during movement. The pattern that responding officers observed at Nancy's entrance is information they have, but that has not been shared publicly, and it would have been one of the first things homicide investigators analyzed when they arrived to process the scene. What the blood evidence tells us, at minimum, is this: Nancy Guthrie bled at or near her own entrance. Something happened at that location that caused her to bleed in a way that left physical evidence. That evidence was visible and significant enough to be documented immediately. And it was confirmed through DNA testing to be hers beyond any scientific doubt. This single piece of evidence is sufficient, on its own, to establish that something occurred at Nancy's entrance that caused her physical injury. Combined with everything else found at the scene, it is part of a pattern that investigators would have read very quickly upon arrival. The second major category of physical evidence is the camera situation, and it deserves to be examined in its two distinct dimensions: the physical removal of the doorbell camera and the digital evidence recovered from back-end systems that allowed the FBI to produce footage despite the physical removal. The doorbell camera at Nancy's home was not found to be offline or malfunctioning. It was not discovered to have been disabled through any electronic or technical means that left the physical device in place. It was physically removed from its mounting. The device was gone. Someone had come to that property, identified the camera, reached it, unmounted it from the wall, and taken it with them when they left. The significance of this action requires careful unpacking, because on the surface it might seem like a simple evidence elimination step. But examined carefully, the physical removal of the camera tells us several specific things about the person who did it and about the nature of the event that occurred at that property. First, and most fundamentally, the decision to physically remove the camera rather than simply disabling it reflects a level of knowledge about how these devices work that goes beyond casual familiarity. Modern doorbell cameras, and specifically Google Nest cameras like the one at Nancy's home, can be disabled through electronic means. Their power can be cut. Their network connection can be disrupted. Their recording can be interrupted through various technical approaches. A person who simply wanted to prevent the camera from recording might have attempted any of these electronic disruption approaches without physically removing the device. The decision to remove the physical device instead suggests that the person doing so understood that electronic disruption alone might not be sufficient. They understood or suspected that data might be stored on the device itself in internal memory, in SD cards, or in ways that could be recovered even after the device's connection was severed. They decided that the only way to ensure the camera could not be used as evidence was to take the physical object with them, eliminating it from the scene entirely. That level of forensic awareness, the understanding that physically removing a device is more thorough than electronically disabling it, speaks to a person who had thought about evidence in advance, who had considered the forensic consequences of their actions at that property, and had made decisions designed to manage those consequences as completely as possible. Second, The physical removal of a doorbell camera is not a quick action. These devices are designed to be durably mounted and resistant to casual removal. They are affixed to walls with hardware designed for permanence. Removing one properly requires tools and takes time. Removing one by force, without proper tools, requires significant physical effort and leaves evidence of the removal on the mounting surface. Either approach takes more time than quickly disabling the device electronically. Either approach requires a level of deliberateness and sustained effort that is inconsistent with a panicked or rushed departure from the scene. The person who removed Nancy's doorbell camera had time to do it. They were at that property long enough and in a position of sufficient control to methodically remove a security device from the wall of the home. That tells us something important about what was happening at the property during the window when they were there. They were not in a hurry. They were not worried about being interrupted. They had the time and the freedom to deal with the camera in a thorough, deliberate way. Third, taking the physical device with them, rather than simply destroying it on site, tells us that they wanted to ensure the device itself could not be examined by investigators. Destroying the camera at the scene would have left evidence of the destruction. Taking it away eliminated the device entirely from the investigative equation, while also removing any evidence of how it was removed. It was a more complete approach to evidence elimination, and choosing it over the simpler option of destroying the device in place reflects a preference for thoroughness over speed. What they could not have anticipated, or perhaps underestimated, is the sophistication of modern digital forensic capabilities. The FBI's ability to recover footage from back-end server systems more than 10 days after the camera was physically removed is a remarkable demonstration of how thoroughly digital data can be preserved in the complex infrastructure that supports modern connected devices. The camera was gone. The device was not at the scene, and yet the footage was recovered. FBI Director Kash Patel described the footage as having been collected from back-end systems. Experts consulted by NBC News confirmed that in some cases it is possible to collect data from the infrastructure that underlies cloud-based camera technology, even when the user does not have an active subscription that saves footage in a conventional sense. The specific technical details of how this was accomplished have not been fully disclosed publicly, which is appropriate given that revealing the specific methods might compromise future investigations that rely on similar techniques. What matters is the result. The footage exists, it was recovered, and it shows a specific individual at Nancy Guthrie's camera at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, 2026, wearing a mask, wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, carrying a gun, and tampering with the device at the precise moment it disconnected from all monitoring. The footage released by the FBI on February 11th is the most significant piece of visual evidence in this entire investigation. It is direct empirical documentation that a specific human being was at Nancy's property at the critical moment. It is not circumstantial. It is not inferred from other evidence. It is visual confirmation of a person doing a specific thing at a specific time and place. And what that footage reveals about the person in it, about their preparation, their intent, and their actions, is extraordinarily informative. The mask covering that person's face is the first detail that warrants analysis. A mask is not worn casually in the middle of the night at a private residence. A mask worn in that context serves one purpose: concealment, the prevention of facial identification. The decision to wear a mask to approach a residential home at 1:47 in the morning reflects a specific and deliberate choice made before arriving at the property. The mask was put on somewhere else, at whatever location the person was before they came to Nancy's home, as part of preparing for what they were going to do. It reflects the anticipation of being visually recorded and the deliberate decision to prevent that recording from capturing an identifiable face. You do not accidentally wear a mask. You do not forget that you are wearing one. Wearing a mask to approach a home in the middle of the night is an intentional, premeditated act that tells investigators this person was thinking about visual evidence before they arrived. They understood they might be captured on camera. They prepared for that possibility. And they executed that preparation by concealing their face before approaching the property. The gloves worn by the person in the footage tell an equivalent story about fingerprint evidence. Fingerprints are among the most powerful forensic identification tools available to investigators. They are unique to individuals. They are relatively straightforward to recover from surfaces. And they can connect a specific person to a specific location with scientific certainty that is very difficult to challenge. The decision to wear gloves while approaching and entering a property reflects the knowledge that ungloved hands touching surfaces create recoverable evidence that can be used for identification. Like the mask, gloves are not worn accidentally or casually. They are worn deliberately, as part of a plan to prevent the deposition of fingerprint evidence on the surfaces the person expected to touch. The gloves in the footage tell investigators that the person wearing them had considered fingerprint evidence in advance, had understood the forensic risk that ungloved contact with surfaces represented, and had taken deliberate preventive action against that risk. Combined, the mask and the gloves paint a portrait of someone who thought carefully about the categories of evidence they might leave at the scene, and who took specific, deliberate steps to prevent the most immediately identifiable categories of that evidence from being available to investigators. This is not the behavior of someone acting impulsively. This is not the behavior of someone who made a spontaneous decision. This is the behavior of someone who planned, who thought about forensic consequences, and who prepared specifically to minimize the evidence they would leave behind. The backpack is a container, and in the context of this event, what it contained matters enormously to understanding what was planned and what occurred. The footage shows a person carrying a backpack as they approach Nancy's property at 1:47 in the morning. The contents of that backpack are not visible in the footage and have not been established publicly through the investigative record. But the presence of a backpack in this context, carried by a masked and armed person approaching a residential home in the middle of the night, immediately raises questions about what it was brought to carry in or carry out. Investigative experience with cases involving residential entry in the middle of the night by armed individuals suggests several categories of items that might be carried in a backpack in this kind of situation. Tools for dealing with security systems and access points, equipment for restraining or immobilizing a person, supplies for a scenario that was expected to take time, items brought for specific purposes related to whatever was planned for that night, and potentially items that were removed from the property during or after the event. The backpack that was brought in and the condition in which it left are both significant investigative questions. If items were removed from the scene in the backpack, that removal would help explain why certain things are not accounted for in the physical evidence. If the backpack was brought with specific equipment for a specific purpose, understanding that equipment helps investigators understand the plan that was executed. The gun is the detail that most fundamentally changes the nature of what the footage shows. The presence of a firearm at this scene means that the person who came to Nancy's property that night came armed with a lethal weapon. They made the decision to carry a gun to that location before they left wherever they came from. They brought it with them as part of what they brought to execute whatever they had planned for that night. In the context of a woman with severe mobility limitations who lived alone, the question of why an armed approach was considered necessary is one that investigators would examine carefully from multiple angles. What scenario did the person anticipate where a gun would be needed? What was the gun intended to accomplish at a property occupied by an elderly woman who could not walk 50 yards without assistance? The presence of the weapon suggests preparation for a possibility that the person considered significant enough to bring lethal capability for. Whether the gun was displayed, whether it was used in any way, is something investigators have not publicly addressed. But its presence in the footage tells us that the decision to bring it was made in advance, as part of the preparation for that night. Now let us turn to the third major category of evidence, which is perhaps the most revealing from a forensic psychology perspective: the personal belongings left behind. When deputies arrived at Nancy's home in the early afternoon of February 1st, they found her personal belongings still inside. Her phone was there, on a surface in the home, exactly where it had been placed. Her medication was there, untouched. Her keys were there. Her purse was there. Every item she would have needed if she were leaving her home voluntarily, everything she would have taken if she had been preparing to go anywhere under her own power, was still inside the home exactly where she had left it. The phone is the most significant of these items for multiple reasons. We live in an era where smartphones are not just tools, but extensions of ourselves. They are how we communicate with everyone we know. They are how we navigate to unfamiliar places and find our way. They are how we access information we need in real time. And for Nancy specifically, the phone had an additional dimension of critical importance. The companion application connected to her pacemaker ran on that phone. The digital monitoring of her cardiac device was maintained through that phone. Her phone was not just a convenience. It was a It was connected to a medical device designed to support her heart function. An elderly woman who relied on daily medication and had a pacemaker would not voluntarily leave her home in the middle of the night without her phone. She would not choose to go somewhere, particularly somewhere that involved being away from home for any extended period, without the device that maintained her pacemaker monitoring. She would not leave without the ability to communicate with anyone, to call for help if needed, to maintain any contact with the world outside wherever she was going. The phone staying behind is not consistent with any scenario involving voluntary departure. The medication carries its own weight as evidence. Nancy's chronic health condition required daily medication, not optional supplementation, not vitamins or over-the-counter treatments that can be skipped without serious consequence. Daily medication for a chronic condition that required management. The medication being left behind tells us that Nancy did not prepare for her departure. She did not have the time, the awareness, or the ability to gather what was essential to her health before whatever happened. She left, or was taken, without the medical support she needed to sustain her health over any extended period. When investigators see essential daily medications left behind at the scene of a disappearance involving someone with a documented chronic condition requiring that medication, it tells them something specific about the nature and the speed of the departure. It was not planned by the person who left. It was not something they had time to prepare for. Whatever happened faster than the time required to gather even the most essential medical supplies. The combination of the phone, the medication, the keys, and the other personal belongings all remaining in the home creates a collective piece of evidence that speaks clearly and unambiguously to a single conclusion. Nancy Guthrie did not leave her home voluntarily. She did not choose to go somewhere. She did not make a decision to depart. She left in a manner and under circumstances that prevented her from taking anything she would have taken if she had any agency over her own movement. Now let us examine what the digital evidence tells us, because the timeline of digital events is extraordinarily specific and provides a level of forensic precision that physical evidence often cannot match. The pacemaker application disconnection at 2:28 in the morning is the final event in the 41-minute window, and it is one that deserves particularly careful analysis because of what it potentially tells us about what was happening to Nancy at that specific moment. Modern pacemakers are connected to companion monitoring applications through Bluetooth or similar near-field communication technology. The connection between the device and the application is designed to be persistent and automatic when the two are within range of each other. The application does not disconnect randomly or casually. There are specific conditions that cause the connection to be severed. The phone moving out of the range of the device, the phone being turned off or losing power, the pacemaker device itself experiencing something that interrupts its communication capability, or in some configurations, a deliberate disconnection initiated by the user. At 2:28 in the morning, 16 minutes after movement was detected at the property without corresponding video, and 41 minutes after the doorbell camera was disabled, the pacemaker application disconnected from Nancy's phone. Since the phone was later found inside the home, there are a limited number of explanations for why that connection was severed at that precise moment. If Nancy and her phone were separated at 2:28, meaning she was moved away from the phone while it remained in the home, or the phone was moved away from her, that would explain the disconnection in a way that is consistent with someone removing Nancy from the property while leaving her phone behind. The moment she crossed outside the Bluetooth range of the phone, the connection would have dropped. If the phone was turned off at 2:28, perhaps by someone who understood that a functioning phone maintains its pacemaker connection and also transmits location data, the disconnection would reflect a deliberate act to silence the phone's communications. Turning off a phone severs its pacemaker connection, prevents GPS tracking, ends cellular communication, and eliminates the device as a source of ongoing location information. In the context of someone trying to prevent investigators from tracking a person's movement through their phone signals, turning off the phone at 2:28 would serve that purpose. Whatever caused the disconnection at 2:28, the timing is significant. It is the last moment at which the technology monitoring Nancy's cardiac device recorded its status. After 2:28, there is no digital record from the pacemaker application. The connection was gone, and with it went the continuous digital link between Nancy's body and the technology designed to monitor her heart. For a woman with Nancy's medical history, the severing of that monitoring connection has implications that go beyond the loss of a digital signal. A pacemaker patient who is separated from their monitoring system, who is in a situation of physical stress or trauma, who is without their medication, faces medical risks that would escalate over time. The monitoring system exists because the pacemaker requires it. The separation from that system is not medically trivial. The timeline also tells us something important about the speed and the sequence of events during those 41 minutes. The first camera went offline at 1:47. Motion was detected without video at 2:12. The pacemaker app disconnected at 2:28. These events did not all happen simultaneously. They happened in sequence, separated by specific intervals of time. The 15 minutes between the camera going offline and the motion detection. The 16 minutes between the motion detection and the pacemaker disconnection. Those intervals tell us that the events of that night unfolded over time. They were not instantaneous. They were not a single explosive moment. They were a sequence of events that took time, that required the person or persons at the property to move from one thing to the next, that involved actions separated by meaningful intervals during which things were happening, that the surveillance systems were either not capturing or not able to capture. What was happening between 1:47 and 2:12? Between the camera going offline and the motion detection on the second camera? What was the person in the FBI footage doing in those 25 minutes after disabling the doorbell camera but before the second camera detected movement? Were they inside the home during that interval? Were they dealing with other aspects of what they had come to do? Were those 25 minutes when whatever happened that left blood evidence at the entrance occurred? And what was happening between 2:12 and 2:28? Between the motion detection and the pacemaker disconnection? Those 16 minutes are when the second camera registered movement without video and when the pacemaker app severed its connection. What occurred during those 16 minutes that produced both the motion detection and the loss of connection to Nancy's cardiac monitoring device? These intervals are where the investigative truth exists. These are the gaps in the documented timeline that investigators have been working to fill through forensic analysis, through the careful examination of all available evidence, through the reconstruction of what the sequence of events tells us about what actually happened during those 41 minutes. Now let us talk about the immediate investigative response, because the speed and the nature of that response is itself evidence about what was found at the scene. Law enforcement agencies have protocols for responding to missing persons reports. Those protocols involve specific steps, specific assessments, and specific escalation criteria that determine when a case moves from one level of response to another. The transition from a standard missing persons response to a full crime scene investigation involving homicide investigators and federal notification does not happen automatically or arbitrarily. It happens when the evidence at the scene meets specific criteria that the protocols recognize as indicators of a serious violent crime. When deputies arrived at Nancy's home at 12:15 in the afternoon on February 1st, they were operating under the missing persons protocol. When homicide investigators were called and the FBI was notified within a very short time of their arrival, the protocol had shifted. Something in that home told the responding officers that what they were dealing with met the criteria for escalation to a violent crime investigation. The criteria that would drive that escalation, the things that investigators would look for to make the determination that this was no longer a missing persons case but a crime scene, include several categories of evidence. Physical evidence of violence, blood, disturbed physical environment indicating a struggle, evidence of forced entry or physical confrontation, the condition and location of the victim's belongings in a way that is inconsistent with voluntary departure, physical conditions in the home that are inconsistent with the normal state of a property whose occupant has simply gone somewhere. We know from public statements that blood was found at the entrance. We know the conditions were described as very concerning and inconsistent with voluntary disappearance. We know homicide investigators were brought in because evidence indicated a crime had occurred inside the residence. What we do not know publicly is the full catalog of what those responding officers observed and what the homicide investigators documented when they processed the scene in detail. But we can reason from the response itself. Law enforcement escalates to homicide investigation when the evidence warrants it, not as a precaution, not as a general best practice in missing persons cases. When the evidence at a scene tells experienced officers that something violent has occurred there. The escalation that happened at Nancy's home on the afternoon of February 1st was driven by what officers saw when they walked through that door, and the speed of that escalation, the immediacy of calling in homicide investigators and notifying the FBI tells us that what they saw was not ambiguous. It was clear enough to drive immediate escalation rather than further assessment. Sheriff Nanos's public language throughout the investigation has been carefully chosen and consistently calibrated to communicate the seriousness of what investigators knew while not revealing details that would compromise the case. When he described the conditions as very concerning, he was using a phrase that in law enforcement context means something specific. Concerning enough to change the nature of the response. Concerning enough that experienced professionals found it notable, not mildly unusual, very concerning. When he said the conditions were inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance, he was stating a professional determination by investigators who have seen voluntary disappearances and who understand what the evidence of voluntary departure looks like. They looked at Nancy's home and made a professional judgment that what they saw was not consistent with her having left on her own terms. That judgment was based on specific evidence, specific observations, specific assessments of the physical conditions at the scene. When he said evidence indicated a crime had occurred inside the residence, he was stating that the scene contained evidence of a criminal act, not potential evidence, not possible evidence. Evidence. Something at that scene told investigators that a crime had happened inside those walls, and the bringing of homicide investigators to process that evidence tells us that the crime the evidence pointed to was serious enough to require death investigation expertise. Now let us examine the ransom notes in the context of all of this evidence, because the ransom communications are where the public narrative and the investigative evidence are in the most striking tension. And understanding that tension is critical to understanding the full picture of this case. The first ransom note arrived on February 2nd. Coldy TV, a CBS affiliate in Tucson, reported receiving a letter demanding payment for Nancy's release. The note apparently contained specific details about Nancy's home and about what she was wearing the night she disappeared. Those specific details led investigators to take the note seriously enough to ask the station not to disclose its full contents. The detail and specificity that made the note seem credible were also details that investigators wanted to control. But here is the analytical tension. The note arrived on February 2nd. By that point, investigators had already spent a full afternoon and evening processing a scene that told them something violent had occurred inside Nancy's home. They had already brought in homicide investigators. They had already documented the blood evidence. They had already begun piecing together what the scene was telling them about the nature of the event that had occurred there. And then a note arrived claiming Nancy was being held for ransom. That specific information about her home and her clothing would be known to someone who was holding her, or it would be known to someone who had been at her home that night and had seen those details firsthand. The information did not tell investigators whether the note came from someone who had Nancy alive, from someone who had been present at the scene of whatever happened to her, or from both the same person. This is the central analytical challenge that the ransom notes created for investigators. The specificity of the notes made them credible in one sense, but that same specificity was equally consistent with the note having come from someone who was at the scene of the crime rather than from someone holding a living captive. Information that proves presence at the scene does not automatically prove ongoing custody of a living victim. TMZ subsequently reported receiving a note demanding millions in Bitcoin with a wallet address and deadline. Harvey Levin reported additional communications claiming Nancy was alive and frightened. The family released videos saying they would pay. The deadline of February 9th at 5 o'clock approached and then passed. And through all of it, investigators were doing two things simultaneously: evaluating the ransom communications as potential evidence that might lead to Nancy or to whoever was responsible, and continuing to build the case based on the physical evidence from the scene, the evidence that did not change regardless of what the ransom notes claimed. The arrest on February 5th of the California man who falsely posed as an abductor illustrated the fundamental problem with the ransom communications. There were people out there, people with no connection to whatever happened to Nancy, who were willing to send fake ransom notes to exploit a family's desperation. His arrest proved that at least some of the communications were fraudulent. It raised the question of how many others were fraudulent, and it demonstrated that the high-profile nature of this case was attracting predatory individuals who saw opportunity in tragedy. For investigators, every fraudulent communication was both a distraction and a data point. A distraction because it consumed resources to evaluate and eliminate. A data point because it demonstrated the pattern of opportunistic exploitation that was occurring in parallel with the actual investigation. The February 11th release of the FBI footage was a strategic decision that served multiple simultaneous purposes. It demonstrated to the public that the investigation had developed significant visual evidence. It generated a massive viewing audience that might recognize the person in the footage. It created investigative pressure by putting the image of the masked individual into public circulation, and it may have precipitated movement from people connected to the case who recognized the footage or who were prompted by its release to take actions that investigators could observe and document. Within hours of the footage being broadcast nationally, deputies stopped a man during a traffic stop south of Tucson. His home in Rio Rico, approximately 40 miles south of the city and roughly 15 miles from the Mexican border, was searched under a court-authorized warrant. He was detained for questioning for several hours. He identified himself to reporters as Carlos Palazuelos and said agents told him he resembled the person in the FBI footage. He described himself as a delivery driver who could not specifically remember whether he had delivered anything to Nancy's address. He was subsequently released without charges being filed. The search warrant for his home required probable cause, which means a judge determined that investigators had presented sufficient reason to believe the location contained evidence relevant to the investigation. Whether that evidence was found, what the investigation of his home revealed, and what his questioning produced are details that have not been made public. The investigation was described as ongoing. The geographic location of Rio Rico is not incidental to the investigative picture. 40 miles south of Tucson, 15 miles from the Mexican border. The involvement of U.S. Customs and Border Protection from the earliest days of the investigation signaled that law enforcement was actively considering the possibility that Nancy had been moved toward or across that border. A person of interest living in a community 15 miles from that border, detained during a traffic stop in the direction of that border, sits within that geographic framework in a way that investigators would have noted carefully. The statement from NBC's national law enforcement correspondent Tom Winter that the investigation into this individual had been ongoing for some time before the detention is one of the most important contextual details in understanding what February 10th actually represented. This was not a spontaneous reaction to someone calling a tip line after seeing the footage. This was a move made by investigators who had been building a case against a specific individual over a period of time and who chose the moment following the footage release to act on the warrant they had obtained. Whether Palazuelos is ultimately connected to what happened to Nancy, whether the investigation led to charges or led elsewhere, those are questions that will be answered through the ongoing investigative process. But his detention and the search of his home tell us that the investigation was developing specific, evidence-based leads that warranted serious investigative action. Now let us think about what all of this evidence, taken together and examined as a coherent whole, tells us about what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home during those 41 minutes. The evidence tells us that someone came to that property in the early hours of February 1st with preparation and planning. Someone who wore a mask to prevent facial identification. Someone who wore gloves to prevent fingerprint evidence. Someone who carried a backpack containing whatever was needed for what they had planned. Someone who carried a gun, prepared for scenarios that might require lethal force. Someone who knew the property well enough to approach the doorbell camera specifically and deal with it at 1:47 in the morning. The evidence tells us that this person moved through or around the property over a period of 41 minutes, triggering a motion sensor at 2:12 without leaving usable video, and being present at or near the property until at least 2:28 when the pacemaker application disconnected. The evidence tells us that something happened at or near the entrance of Nancy's home that caused her to bleed. Blood confirmed through DNA testing to be hers. Blood significant enough to be documented, collected, and forensically processed. Blood at a location that speaks to an event at the threshold of her home. The evidence tells us that Nancy's phone, her medication, her keys, and her other essential belongings were all left inside the home when she was no longer there. Evidence of departure under circumstances that prevented any preparation, any gathering of necessities, any exercise of agency over what she took with her. The evidence tells us that the conditions at the scene were significant enough that responding officers escalated immediately to homicide investigation, that the FBI was notified within the first hours, and that law enforcement described what they found as very concerning and indicative of a crime having occurred inside the residence. And the evidence tells us that the FBI, more than 10 days after the event, was able to recover footage from back-end systems showing a specific individual at Nancy's property at the precise moment the first camera disconnected. That individual masked and gloved and armed and carrying a backpack, an individual whose identity investigators have been working to establish as one of the central tasks of this investigation. These pieces of evidence are not independent. They are not random fragments of information that happen to exist in the same case. They are a coherent, interconnected picture of what happened during 41 minutes in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. They tell a story that has a specific shape, a specific internal logic, a specific set of implications about the nature of the event that occurred, and about the person or persons responsible for it. The ransom notes that arrived the following day, the demands for millions of dollars, the claims that Nancy was alive and frightened. Those communications exist in tension with the evidence from the scene in ways that investigators have been carefully analyzing throughout this case. The physical evidence does not change based on what the notes claim. The blood is still at the entrance. The timeline of digital disconnections is still documented. The footage still shows what it shows. The conditions that drove homicide investigators to process the scene are still part of the investigative record, regardless of what any ransom note claimed about a living captive waiting to be exchanged for money. Savannah Guthrie said on February 10th that the family believes Nancy is still alive and out there. That statement reflects the family's hope, the family's need to believe that their actions can still make a difference, and whatever information the family has been given or has chosen to hold on to in the face of enormous uncertainty. It is a statement of faith and love and the desperate desire to believe that the person you love can still be brought home. But the evidence from Nancy's home does not shift based on hope. The blood was there. The camera was removed. The conditions required homicide investigators. The timeline tells its story with the precision of digital timestamps that cannot be argued with. Whatever the truth is about Nancy's condition as of the time this was recorded, the evidence from her home tells us that something serious and violent occurred there during those 41 minutes. And that truth deserves to be acknowledged and understood, even when it is difficult, even when it conflicts with what a family needs to believe, even when it is harder to sit with than the narrative of a kidnapping that might still be resolved through payment. Nancy Guthrie is a real person. She deserves to have what happened to her understood accurately. She deserves to have her case investigated and pursued and prosecuted based on what the evidence actually shows. She deserves to have her story told with honesty, with the kind of analytical seriousness that the evidence demands, and with the respect that every human being deserves, regardless of the circumstances of what happened to them. The investigation is ongoing. The evidence continues to be processed and analyzed. The leads continue to be pursued. And the truth of what happened during those 41 minutes, the truth that the blood and the cameras and the timeline and the forensics are working together to establish, is what investigators are working every available hour to fully and completely understand. If you have any information that could be relevant to this investigation, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI immediately. A case where footage was recovered from back-end systems after a camera was physically removed is a case where no detail is too small. In investigations of this complexity, information that seems minor or tangential can be the thread that connects everything. Make that call. Report what you know. The investigators working this case need every piece of information they can get. Subscribe to True Crime Vault and hit that notification bell so you are here when the next significant development breaks. This case is moving, and when new evidence becomes public, when charges are filed, when the full truth of what happened to Nancy begins to emerge through the legal process, we will be here to analyze it with the same depth, the same commitment to accuracy, and the same respect for the evidence that we have brought to this video. Hit that like button and share this with anyone who has been following this case and wants to understand what the evidence actually shows. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What does the combination of evidence tell you about what happened during those 41 minutes? What questions do you still have that the evidence as publicly reported does not yet answer? What aspects of the investigative response do you find most revealing? This community takes these cases seriously, and the conversation in these comments is always substantive and always worth having. Nancy Guthrie deserves the truth. The evidence at her home begins to tell that truth. And here at True Crime Vault, we follow the evidence wherever it leads, for as long as it takes, because real people and real cases deserve nothing less than the full commitment of serious, honest, evidence-based analysis.